Welcome back, everyone. I am your host, Sleepless Miner, and tonight we're diving deep into some of the most compelling Reddit stories that have kept people awake. Scrolling through threads in the early hours, these are the tales that make you question family loyalty, trust, and the lengths people will go to protect what they believe is theirs. Whether you're here to unwind after a long day or need something to occupy your mind as you drift off, these stories will take you through the full spectrum of human experience. So get comfortable, settle in, and let's explore these unforgettable Reddit stories together. I never thought I'd be the type of father to cancel my own daughter's wedding, but here we are. I'm 52, been married to my wife Elena for 15 years, and I have a 28-year-old daughter named Sarah from my first marriage. Sarah has always been what you might call a handful. Dropped out of college twice, struggled with substance issues in her early 20s, and has this way of making everyone else's problems feel like emergencies that require my immediate attention and usually my wallet. About 2 years ago, Sarah moved back in with her boyfriend Marcus after losing another job. They'd been together on and off for 5 years, and while Marcus seems like a decent enough guy, neither of them has what you'd call a stable career. Sarah's been living off the money I send her each month, which isn't exactly pocket change. I make good money as a contractor, but supporting 2 households gets expensive quickly. When Sarah announced her engagement 8 months ago, I was genuinely happy for her. Despite all our struggles, she's my daughter, and I wanted nothing more than to see her settled and happy. Elena was supportive too, even though Sarah has never been particularly warm toward her stepmother. When Sarah started talking about her dream wedding, I made a decision that I now realize was probably my biggest mistake. I offered to pay for the entire thing. The wedding planning started immediately. Sarah wanted everything to be perfect, and by perfect, I mean expensive. The venue alone was going to cost $12,000, and that was just the beginning. Catering, flowers, photography, the dress, everything kept adding up. Every conversation became about some new detail that absolutely had to be included, some upgrade that would make the day even more special. I won't lie, watching the numbers climb made me nervous. But this was my daughter's wedding, and I kept telling myself it was a once-in-a-lifetime event. I worked extra jobs, picked up weekend projects, and dipped into my savings account. Elena tried to suggest we set a budget, but Sarah would get upset whenever we mentioned money, saying we were ruining her special day with our stress about finances. 3 months before the wedding, I asked Sarah for the guest list so I could start planning my own preparations. That's when things got weird. She kept putting me off, saying she was still working on it, still figuring out the seating arrangements. When I pressed her about it, she'd change the subject or suddenly remember some urgent wedding task that needed her immediate attention. 2 weeks before the wedding, I called the venue directly to confirm some details about the reception. The coordinator was professional but seemed confused when I introduced myself as the father of the bride. She asked me to hold on while she checked her files, and when she came back, her tone had changed completely. She told me that according to her records, I wasn't listed as an attendee. Not just not listed as the father of the bride, but not listed as a guest at all. I thought there had been some mistake, maybe a clerical error. I explained that I was paying for the entire wedding and obviously would be attending. The coordinator put me on hold again, and this time, when she returned, she sounded extremely uncomfortable. She explained that she had specific instructions from Sarah that under no circumstances were my wife and I to be included in any wedding communications or arrangements. The coordinator had assumed I was some kind of estranged relative trying to crash the wedding. When I asked to see the guest list, she initially refused, but when I explained that my credit card was paying for everything, she agreed to email it to me. I stared at that guest list for 20 minutes, reading through every single name twice. Sarah's friends, Marcus's family, co-workers, college acquaintances, even people I'd never heard of. But my name wasn't there. Elena's name wasn't there. It was like we didn't exist. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I'd been working myself to exhaustion for months to pay for a wedding I wasn't even invited to attend. My own daughter had deliberately excluded me from the most important day of her life, while expecting me to fund the entire celebration. I drove to Sarah's apartment immediately. She was home alone. Marcus was at work, and when she opened the door, I could see the guilt flash across her face before she quickly composed herself. She knew exactly why I was there. I asked her directly why my name wasn't on the guest list. Sarah didn't deny it or try to claim it was a mistake. Instead, she just shrugged and said it was her day, and she could invite whoever she wanted. When I reminded her that I was paying for this day she supposedly owned, she actually rolled her eyes. That's when she said something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. She told me that I should be grateful she was even letting me pay for it, that most daughters wouldn't give their fathers such an honor. She said I owed her this wedding because of all the times I disappointed her growing up, all the things I couldn't afford to buy her, all the experiences she'd missed because we weren't wealthy enough. I asked her why she would exclude Elena, who had never been anything but kind to her. Sarah's mask slipped completely then. She said she was embarrassed by us, that we didn't fit the image she wanted for her perfect day. Her friends all had successful parents, and she didn't want to explain why her father was just a contractor and her stepmother was a school secretary. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there. Sarah accused me of trying to control her life, of making everything about money. She said if I really loved her, I'd be happy to contribute without expecting anything in return. When I pointed out that contribution usually implies some level of inclusion, she called me selfish and manipulative. I left her apartment in a daze. The drive home was a blur of anger, hurt, and disbelief. Elena took one look at my face and knew something terrible had happened. When I told her everything, she just held me while I cried for the first time in years. That night, we talked for hours about what to do. Elena suggested we could attend anyway, show up and dare Sarah to have us removed. But the thought of being humiliated in front of all those guests, of being treated like unwelcome intruders at an event I'd paid for, made me sick. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called the wedding coordinator and canceled everything. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, everything. Most of the deposits were non-refundable, which meant I was out nearly $8,000, but I didn't care. I was done being taken advantage of. The coordinator was shocked and tried to talk me out of it, explaining how difficult it would be for Sarah to find replacements with such short notice. I told her that wasn't my problem anymore. I also called my credit card company and disputed any charges that hadn't been processed yet. I didn't tell Sarah what I'd done. I figured she'd find out soon enough. Elena was worried I'd regret such a drastic decision, but I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since the wedding planning began, I could breathe without feeling the weight of financial stress and emotional manipulation crushing my chest. Sarah found out 2 days later when the venue called to confirm the cancellation. She showed up at my house screaming, accusing me of ruining her life, of destroying her relationship with Marcus's family who were already traveling for the wedding. She demanded I fix it immediately, said I had no right to cancel arrangements for her wedding. I told her it stopped being her wedding the moment she decided I wasn't worthy of attending it. If she wanted a wedding without me, she could pay for a wedding without me. Sarah threatened to sue me, to turn the whole family against me, to make sure I never saw any future grandchildren. I told her that someone who could treat her father with such contempt probably wasn't ready for the responsibilities of marriage anyway. The wedding day came and went. I spent it working in my garden, trying not to think about what might have been. Elena made my favorite dinner, and we watched old movies until late. It should have been one of the happiest days of my life, but instead it felt like a funeral for the relationship I thought I had with my daughter. The aftermath was brutal. Sarah turned half the family against me, telling everyone I was a controlling monster who sabotaged her wedding out of spite. Some relatives believed her version of events. Others, particularly my sister who had watched Sarah's entitled behavior for years, supported my decision. The family gatherings became minefields of tension, and whispered conversations. Marcus's family was apparently understanding about the situation, though I imagine their opinion of Sarah changed significantly. I heard through the family grapevine that Sarah and Marcus postponed their plans indefinitely, though whether that was due to financial constraints or relationship problems, I don't know. 6 months later, Sarah hasn't spoken to me directly, though she's made sure I know through other family members that she considers me dead to her. Part of me grieves for the relationship we lost, but a larger part of me feels free for the first time in years. I'm no longer walking on eggshells, no longer sacrificing my financial security for someone who viewed my love as an obligation rather than a gift. Elena and I are talking about taking a real vacation next year with the money I'm no longer spending on someone who couldn't even invite me to share in her joy. Sometimes the people we sacrifice everything for turn out to be the ones who respect us the least. I never imagined that trying to help my sister start a family would end with restraining orders and police reports, but here we are. I'm 30 years old, work as a flight attendant, and spend my free time trying to get my writing published. My identical twin sister Emma has been married to David for 8 years, and for the past 5 years, their lives have revolved entirely around trying to have a baby. Emma and I have always been close, the kind of twins who finish each other's sentences and can sense when something's wrong even from across the country. When she started struggling with infertility, I felt her pain as acutely as if it were my own. She spent thousands of dollars on IVF treatments, hormone injections that made her sick and emotional, and procedures that left her physically and mentally drained. The worst part was the miscarriage 3 years ago. She was 12 weeks along, far enough that they'd started buying baby clothes and picking out names. Losing that pregnancy nearly destroyed her. David seemed supportive at first, holding her while she cried, accompanying her to doctor appointments, researching alternative treatments online. But as the years passed and the treatments continued failing, I started noticing changes in their dynamic. Emma became increasingly anxious and desperate, while David grew more distant and controlling. Family gatherings became tense affairs where every conversation somehow circled back to their fertility struggles. 3 weeks ago, Emma came to my apartment with that look in her eyes that I'd learned to recognize over the years. It was the look that meant she'd had another idea, another solution, another way to make her dream of motherhood come true. We were sitting on my couch watching Netflix when she suddenly muted the television and turned to face me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. She asked if I remembered how we used to joke as kids about being so identical that we could fool anyone, even our parents. I laughed and said, of course, wondering where this was leading. That's when she dropped the bombshell. She wanted me to be her surrogate. The request hit me like a physical blow. I'd always known I didn't want children of my own. The idea of pregnancy, of my body being taken over by another life, had never appealed to me. I love kids, but I've never felt that maternal pull that other women describe. My career as a flight attendant keeps me traveling constantly, and my writing is finally starting to gain some traction with literary magazines. A pregnancy would derail everything I've worked toward. I tried to explain this gently, but Emma's face immediately hardened. She said she wasn't asking me to raise the child, just to carry it for 9 months. She kept emphasizing that because we're identical twins, the baby would have both her and David's DNA, which was apparently crucial to their plan. When I suggested other options, like adoption or using a professional surrogate, she became agitated and said those weren't real solutions. That's when I made what I thought was a reasonable compromise. I offered to donate my eggs instead. I explained that since we're identical, my eggs would be genetically the same as hers, so they could still have their biological child without me having to carry the pregnancy. I thought this was the perfect solution, but Emma's reaction was explosive. She started screaming about how I was being selfish and jealous, how I didn't understand what she was going through, how this was such a simple thing I could do for her, but I was refusing out of spite. She said I'd always been the lucky one, getting to travel the world and pursue my dreams while she was stuck in a marriage trying desperately to create life. The accusations kept coming, getting more personal and vicious with each sentence. I tried to calm her down, to explain that donating eggs was still a significant medical procedure and a generous offer. But she was beyond reason. She knocked over a framed photo of us from my coffee table and stormed out, shouting that if I couldn't do this one thing for her, I could never call myself her sister again. The next few days were eerily quiet. Emma didn't return my calls or respond to my texts. I started to hope that maybe she just needed time to process and would eventually realize that my offer was actually quite generous. I was wrong. The following weekend, we had a family dinner at our parents' house. Emma and David arrived together, and I could immediately tell something was different about their dynamic. David kept his arm around Emma possessively, and she seemed smaller somehow, more fragile than usual. When I tried to talk to her privately, David would suddenly appear at her side with some urgent question or comment. During dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to their fertility struggles. That's when David started talking in a way that made my skin crawl. He kept referring to Emma's miscarriage as something she had done wrong, subtly implying that she was somehow responsible for losing the baby. He used phrases like, "when Emma failed to carry the pregnancy," and "after Emma lost our child," always with this tone that suggested blame. But the worst part was how he talked about me. David started making comments about how some people are too selfish to help family members in need. How modern women prioritize their careers over supporting the people who love them. He never mentioned the surrogacy request directly, but everyone at the table could feel the tension and understand what he was implying. Emma sat there quietly, nodding along with everything David said. When I tried to defend myself, explaining that I'd offered to help in other ways, David cut me off and said that half measures weren't the same as real sacrifice. He looked directly at me and said that some people talk about family loyalty but run away when asked to prove it. That's when I realized how much David had been manipulating Emma behind the scenes. This wasn't just about having a baby anymore. This was about control, about David using Emma's desperation to isolate her from anyone who might question his behavior. I tried to catch Emma's eye, to silently communicate that I was concerned about how David was treating her, but she wouldn't look at me. After dinner, I pulled Emma aside in the kitchen and tried to have an honest conversation about what was happening. I told her I was worried about how David was talking about her miscarriage, how he seemed to be blaming her for something that was completely beyond her control. Emma's response chilled me to the bone. She said David was just being honest about her failures, that maybe if I understood how it felt to disappoint the person you love most, I'd be more willing to help fix the situation. The stalking started 2 days later. I first noticed David's car following me home from work, staying about 3 car lengths behind but making every turn I made. When I pulled into a grocery store parking lot to test my suspicions, he drove past without stopping, but I'd already seen his face clearly through the windshield. Over the next week, the incidents escalated. David showed up at my apartment complex, claiming to be delivering something for Emma. But when I looked outside, Emma wasn't with him, and he was just sitting in his car staring at my building. He started appearing at places where I regularly went, the coffee shop near my apartment, the gym I frequent, always just coincidentally there when I arrived. You know, it's terrifying how quickly someone's desperation can turn into dangerous obsession. When people become so focused on getting what they want that they lose sight of basic human decency, they're capable of things that would have seemed impossible just months before. The lengths some people will go to control others, especially when they're driven by that toxic combination of entitlement and desperation, never ceases to amaze me. The situation reached a breaking point when David showed up at my workplace. I was checking in for a flight to Denver when the gate agent told me there was a family emergency and my husband was at the information desk asking for me. I knew immediately that something was wrong since I'm not married. But I followed the agent anyway, thinking maybe there had been some mix-up with emergency contact information. David was standing at the information desk, looking distressed and official, telling the staff that I was his wife and that my mother had been in a car accident. He said he needed to speak with me urgently before my flight departed. The airport employees were trying to be helpful, but when I approached and told them this man wasn't my husband and there was no emergency, the situation became tense very quickly. David started insisting that I was confused that the stress of my mother's accident was making me irrational. He tried to grab my arm and guide me away from the information desk, saying we needed to talk privately about the family crisis. When I pulled away and raised my voice, asking security to remove this stranger who was harassing me, David's mask completely slipped. He leaned close to my ear and whispered that Emma needed me to do the right thing, that he wasn't going to let me destroy their chance at happiness just because I was too selfish to carry their child. He said he knew where I lived, where I worked, and where I went on my days off. He promised that he would keep showing up until I agreed to help them, that he had all the time in the world to make my life uncomfortable. Airport security intervened at that point, and David was escorted off the property. I filed a police report, but because he hadn't technically threatened me with physical violence, there wasn't much they could do beyond documenting the incident. I changed my phone number, varied my daily routines, and started looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. The final incident happened outside my apartment building. I was coming home from a late flight, exhausted and carrying my overnight bag, when David stepped out from between two parked cars. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, blocking my path to the building entrance. When I tried to walk around him, he grabbed a handful of my hair and yanked hard enough that I stumbled backward. That's when he finally revealed the full extent of his delusion. He said Emma was wasting away from grief, that every month she didn't get pregnant was killing her a little more. He blamed me for her deteriorating mental health, said I was murdering his wife by refusing to help them. He told me that if Emma couldn't have a baby, neither of them would survive the disappointment, and their deaths would be on my conscience forever. A neighbor heard me screaming and called the police. David ran before they arrived, but I had scratches on my neck where he'd grabbed me and several witnesses who'd seen the assault. This time, the police took the situation seriously. They arrested David the next morning and charged him with stalking and assault. Emma came to see me after David's arrest, and for the first time in weeks, she looked like my sister again, instead of a hollow shell controlled by her husband's manipulation. She was crying and apologizing, saying she'd known David was contacting me but hadn't realized how far his behavior had escalated. She admitted that he'd been telling her I was being deliberately cruel, that I was enjoying watching her suffer because I was jealous of her marriage. Through her tears, Emma revealed that David had been psychologically abusing her for months, telling her the miscarriage was her fault, that her body was defective, that she was failing him as a wife by not being able to carry a pregnancy to term. He'd convinced her that my refusal to be a surrogate was the final proof that no one really cared about her, that even her twin sister would abandon her when she needed help most. Emma moved in with our parents while David was in jail awaiting trial. She started therapy and slowly began to see how completely his manipulation had distorted her perception of reality. The sister I'd grown up with started to emerge from the desperate, broken woman she'd become. Though I could see it would take time for her to fully heal from the psychological damage David had inflicted. David eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to probation with a restraining order requiring him to stay away from both Emma and me. Emma filed for divorce while he was still in jail, and as far as I know, they've had no contact since his release. Our relationship is still fragile, still rebuilding from the damage that desperation and manipulation caused. Emma understands now that my offer to donate eggs was actually a significant sacrifice, and she's grateful that I was willing to help in the way that I could. We're working together in therapy to repair the trust that was broken during those terrible weeks when David's influence poisoned everything between us. Family loyalty can become twisted when desperation takes control. I never thought I'd have to choose between supporting my brother and protecting my son. But sometimes, life forces impossible decisions on you. My son Marcus is 13 now, but this story starts when he was 12, back when his uncle Jake could do no wrong in his eyes. I'm a single dad, have been since Marcus was 3 when his mom decided motherhood wasn't for her. It's been just the two of us for most of his life, which means the relationships he has with my family have always been especially important to him. Jake is my younger brother, 5 years my junior, and he's always been the fun uncle. While I was working overtime to keep us afloat and maintain some semblance of stability, Jake was the guy who showed up with surprise baseball tickets, who taught Marcus to skateboard, who let him stay up late playing video games when he slept over. Marcus worshipped him in the way that only kids can worship the adults who make life feel magical and possibility-filled. Every weekend, Marcus would ask if Uncle Jake was coming over or if we could visit him. They had this routine where Jake would pick Marcus up on Saturday mornings and they'd spend the day doing whatever struck their fancy. Sometimes it was fishing. Sometimes it was going to movies I deemed too mature. Sometimes it was just wandering around the city, trying new restaurants and talking about everything and nothing. Marcus would come home from these adventures glowing with excitement, full of stories about what Uncle Jake had taught him or the conversations they'd had. When Marcus started talking about what he wanted to be when he grew up, every answer somehow related back to something Jake did or said. He wanted to be a marine biologist like Jake had considered before switching to accounting. He wanted to learn guitar because Jake played. He even started copying Jake's mannerisms, the way he gestured when telling stories, the phrases he used. It was sweet and a little heartbreaking, seeing my son so desperately want a male role model to pattern himself after. So when Jake announced his engagement to Lisa 18 months ago, Marcus was over the moon. He immediately started asking about the wedding, whether he'd be the ring bearer, whether he could give a speech about how awesome his uncle was. Jake seemed just as excited about including Marcus in the celebration, talking about how Marcus would be his best man if he weren't too young, promising him a special role in the ceremony. Lisa seemed nice enough when Jake first introduced her to the family. She was polite, asked appropriate questions about Marcus's school and interests, brought him small gifts when they visited. She worked in marketing for a luxury resort chain, which explained how she and Jake had met during one of his business trips. She talked about travel and fine dining in a way that made it clear she was accustomed to a certain lifestyle, but she never seemed condescending about our more modest circumstances. The wedding planning consumed Jake and Lisa for months. Every conversation became about venues and caterers and photographers. Lisa wanted a destination wedding, something elegant and sophisticated that would create the perfect backdrop for their new life together. Jake was happy to go along with whatever made her happy, even though the costs kept escalating beyond what I thought he could realistically afford. 6 months before the wedding date, they announced they'd chosen a resort in the Caribbean. Lisa was practically glowing as she described the white sand beaches, the infinity pools, the 5-star spa services. The resort looked absolutely stunning in the photos they showed us, like something out of a travel magazine. Marcus was immediately excited about the idea of a beach vacation, asking questions about snorkeling and whether there would be other kids at the resort. That's when Lisa dropped the bombshell, though she presented it so casually that it took a moment for the implications to sink in. She mentioned that the resort had a strict adults-only policy. No guests under 16 allowed anywhere on the property. She said this like it was a minor detail, something we'd obviously understand was necessary for the sophisticated atmosphere they wanted to create. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions as he processed what this meant. Confusion first, then dawning realization, then devastation. He looked at Jake with this expression of betrayal that broke my heart. Jake seemed almost as shocked as Marcus, and when I caught his eye, I could see he hadn't known about the age restriction either. Marcus asked in a small voice if that meant he couldn't come to the wedding. Lisa answered before Jake could speak, confirming that yes, unfortunately the resort policy meant children couldn't attend. She suggested that maybe we could plan a separate celebration for Marcus when they returned, something fun just for him. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there. Marcus started crying, not the dramatic wailing of a toddler having a tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken tears of a kid who's just realized that someone he trusted implicitly has disappointed him in a fundamental way. He begged Jake to choose a different venue, somewhere that would allow him to attend. He even offered his savings, about $400 he'd been collecting for months, to help pay for a different location if money was the issue. Jake looked torn, glancing between Marcus and Lisa with obvious discomfort. For a moment, I thought he might actually consider changing their plans. But Lisa's reaction was swift and harsh. She told Marcus he was being selfish, that he needed to understand this wasn't about him. She said planning a wedding was stressful enough without having to accommodate everyone's preferences, and that sometimes adults made decisions based on what was best for their relationship. Then she said something that I'll never forgive her for. She looked directly at my crying son and told him that if he really loved his uncle, he'd want Jake to have the wedding of his dreams instead of trying to make everything about himself. She said this was Jake's special day, not Marcus's, and that a mature person would be happy for the couple instead of throwing a tantrum about not getting invited to a party. The cruelty of it took my breath away. This was a 12-year-old boy who had just learned that the adult he most admired in the world was willing to exclude him from one of the most important celebrations of his life. Instead of acknowledging his disappointment with kindness or empathy, Lisa was attacking him for having completely natural feelings about the situation. Jake finally spoke up. But instead of defending Marcus or challenging Lisa's harsh words, he just mumbled an apology and said they'd try to make it up to him somehow. He suggested they could take a special trip together when they got back from their honeymoon, just the two of them, somewhere Marcus had always wanted to go. Marcus wiped his eyes and said very quietly that he understood. He congratulated Jake on his engagement and excused himself to his room. I followed him a few minutes later and found him staring at the ceiling. Not crying anymore, but looking older somehow, like something innocent had been permanently damaged. Over the following weeks, Marcus's behavior toward Jake changed dramatically. The weekend adventures stopped happening, not because Jake canceled them, but because Marcus always had other plans when Jake called. The excitement about seeing his uncle was replaced by polite but distant courtesy. When Jake tried to engage him in their usual banter, Marcus would give short answers and find excuses to leave the room. Jake seemed genuinely confused by the change in their relationship. He kept trying to win Marcus back with increasingly elaborate gestures, expensive gifts, and promises of future adventures. But Marcus had made some internal decision that I recognized even if Jake didn't. He was protecting himself from further disappointment by creating emotional distance from someone who had proven they would choose other priorities over him. The wedding came and went. Jake sent photos of the beautiful ceremony, the pristine beaches, the happy couple surrounded by their adult friends and family. Marcus looked at the pictures politely when I showed them to him but didn't comment. It was like he was looking at strangers. When Jake returned from his honeymoon, he tried to re-establish their old routine. He showed up one Saturday morning unannounced, expecting Marcus to be ready for their usual adventure. Marcus told him he had homework and couldn't go. The next weekend, Marcus had plans with friends. The weekend after that, he was helping me with yard work. Jake started getting frustrated, asking me to intervene and make Marcus spend time with him. I explained that Marcus was getting older and developing his own interests, that maybe their relationship was naturally evolving as he became more independent. But I could see Jake was hurt by what felt like rejection. The confrontation happened at my mother's house during Sunday dinner 2 months after the wedding. The whole extended family was there, including Jake and Lisa, who were still glowing from their honeymoon period. My mother asked Marcus about his plans for high school, whether he was still thinking about following in Jake's footsteps and studying business. Marcus looked directly at Jake and said very calmly that he had changed his mind about wanting to be like his uncle. He said he'd rather be the kind of person who doesn't abandon people they claim to care about. The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa immediately got defensive, asking what Marcus meant by that comment. Marcus, showing more composure than I would have managed at his age, said he meant exactly what he'd said. He told Jake that he'd learned an important lesson about what really matters to people, and that he'd rather surround himself with people who choose differently. Jake tried to explain about the resort policy, about how they'd wanted Marcus there but couldn't control the venue restrictions. Marcus listened quietly, and then asked why they hadn't chosen a different venue if including him was actually important to them. When Jake couldn't answer that question, Marcus excused himself from the table. Jake and Lisa left shortly afterward, both clearly upset by the public nature of Marcus's rejection. Several family members tried to convince me that I should force Marcus to apologize, that he was being disrespectful and needed to learn about adult compromises and wedding planning realities. but I couldn't bring myself to undermine Marcus's boundaries. He hadn't been rude or cruel in his rejection of Jake's attempts to rebuild their relationship. He'd simply decided that someone who would exclude him from important moments wasn't worth the emotional investment he'd been making. That seemed like a mature and self-protective decision, not something I should punish him for making. Instead, I started planning activities that Marcus and I could do together, filling some of the gap that Jake's absence had left in his weekends. We started going to baseball games, trying new restaurants, taking weekend trips to museums and national parks. Marcus seemed happier and more relaxed than he'd been in months, like he'd freed himself from the anxiety of waiting for the next disappointment. Jake continued trying to rebuild their relationship for several more months, but Marcus remained politely distant. Eventually, Jake seemed to accept that their old closeness was gone, though I could tell he never really understood why Marcus couldn't just get over the wedding situation and move on. I don't regret supporting Marcus through his decision to protect himself from further hurt. Sometimes protecting our children means standing firm against family expectations. I'm still trying to process what happened to my family. And honestly, writing this out is the only way I can make sense of it all. I'm 29, married to Tom for 6 years, and we have 2 young kids, Riley who's 4 and Emma who's 2. Until last month, I thought we had a solid marriage. Tom works in IT. I'm a part-time graphic designer, and we've built what I thought was a pretty good life together in our suburban neighborhood. The whole nightmare started with something so small I almost dismissed it entirely. I was buckling Riley into her car seat after picking her up from daycare when I felt something crinkle between the seat cushions. I pulled it out and found a tampon, still in its wrapper. That wouldn't normally be strange except for one crucial detail. I haven't had a period in over a year because of my IUD, and this wasn't a brand I recognized. When I showed Tom the tampon that evening, he looked genuinely puzzled. He suggested it probably belonged to his coworker Melissa, since he sometimes gives rides to people from the office when their cars are in the shop. That made perfect sense, so I threw it away and didn't think about it again. 2 weeks later, I found another one in my sock drawer. This time, I was definitely confused. I asked Tom about it, and he seemed just as baffled as I was. He suggested maybe it had gotten mixed up with our laundry somehow, though that explanation felt pretty weak. Still, I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, so I let it go. The third tampon appeared in our guest bathroom, tucked behind the hand towels where I'd definitely notice it. By this point, I was starting to feel paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was deliberately placing these tampons for me to find. Tom suggested I was overthinking things, that maybe I'd bought them before getting my IUD and forgotten about them. When I pointed out that these were a brand I'd never used, he just shrugged and said maybe someone had left them at our house during a party. I started paying closer attention to everything happening in our home. Tom had been working from home more frequently lately, which he explained as a new flexible work arrangement his company was trying out. On days when I had client meetings or design deadlines, he'd stay home with the kids instead of sending them to daycare. I appreciated the help and the money we saved on childcare, but something about the timing felt off in ways I couldn't articulate. The breakthrough came when Emma got sick with a stomach bug. I wanted to stay home with her, but Tom insisted he could handle it and that I shouldn't miss my important client presentation. When I got home that evening, Emma was dressed in a onesie I'd never seen before, complete with a little bow in her hair that definitely wasn't ours. The onesie was the kind with snaps running down the entire front, which I hate because they make diaper changes unnecessarily complicated. I asked Tom where the clothes had come from, and he looked genuinely confused. He said Emma had been wearing that outfit when he picked her up from daycare, which made no sense because I'd dressed her myself that morning in completely different clothes. When I pressed him about it, he suggested I was stressed and maybe misremembering what I'd put her in. He said the bow must have come from daycare, though Emma hadn't been to daycare that day because she was sick. That's when I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Tom kept insisting that I was confused, that work stress was making me paranoid and forgetful. He suggested I should consider seeing someone to talk about anxiety, since I was clearly struggling to keep track of simple details about our daily life. The gaslighting was so subtle and consistent that I almost started believing him. But then I remembered our Ring doorbell camera, Tom had installed it 6 months earlier for security, and it recorded everyone who came and went from our front door. I'd never bothered checking the footage before, but something was driving me to look. I waited until Tom was in the shower and pulled up the app on my phone. What I saw made my blood run cold. The timestamp showed 10:30 a.m. on the day Emma had been sick, when Tom was supposedly alone with her. The footage clearly showed Tom walking up to our front door with both kids and a woman I recognized immediately. Even though I hadn't seen her in over 3 years. It was Tom's sister, Jessica. Jessica, who was a registered sex offender. Jessica, who had been banned from our home and our lives after we discovered she'd been molesting children in her previous neighborhood. Jessica, who Tom had promised me would never have contact with our family again. I sat in our bedroom staring at that footage, watching my husband walk into our home with a predator and our children, and I felt something fundamental break inside me. Every strange incident of the past few months suddenly made perfect sense. The tampons belonged to Jessica. The mysterious clothes changes happened when Jessica was alone with our kids while Tom ran errands. The gaslighting about my memory and mental state was designed to keep me from investigating further. I scrolled back through weeks of footage and found dozens of instances where Tom had brought Jessica to our house during his supposed work-from-home days. On days when I thought he was lovingly caring for our children, he was actually allowing a convicted sex offender to babysit them while he did whatever errands he needed to run. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Tom had been systematically lying to me for months, endangering our children, and manipulating me into questioning my own sanity when I noticed signs that something was wrong. The tampons hadn't been random. Jessica had been deliberately placing them where I'd find them, probably getting some sick satisfaction from watching me puzzle over their mysterious appearances. When Tom got out of the shower, I was sitting on our bed with my laptop open. The Ring footage paused on a clear image of him, Jessica, and our children walking into our house together. He saw the screen, and his face went completely white. For a moment, he tried to continue the lie, claiming the footage must be corrupted, or that I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. But when I played the video, and he heard his own voice talking to Jessica, he finally broke down and admitted everything. He said Jessica had been reaching out to him for months, claiming she'd gotten help and changed, that she deserved a chance to reconnect with family. He'd been meeting with her secretly, and when she expressed interest in getting to know his children, he'd convinced himself that supervised visits would be harmless. The supervision, it turned out, had been minimal at best. Jessica had been staying in our home for hours at a time, sleeping in our bed when I was away on work trips, even babysitting our kids when Tom had his own errands to run. He admitted that he'd known I would never approve, which was why he'd kept it secret and tried to make me doubt my own perceptions when I started noticing signs of her presence. I asked him about the tampons, and he looked genuinely confused. When I pressed him, he called Jessica and put her on speaker. She admitted to leaving them around the house, laughing as she explained that she wanted to mess with me, to see if she could drive me crazy with small, unexplainable mysteries. She seemed to think this psychological torment was amusing, just a harmless prank rather than a deliberate attempt to undermine my mental stability. That conversation was the final straw. I packed bags for myself and the kids that same night and drove to my mother's house. Tom has been calling and texting constantly, alternating between apologies and accusations that I'm overreacting. He claims Jessica never hurt the children, that he was always careful to supervise their interactions, that I'm being hysterical about a situation he had completely under control, but the damage is done. He allowed a registered sex offender unsupervised access to our children while systematically gaslighting me about my own perceptions and mental state. When I started noticing signs that something was wrong, instead of being honest about what was happening, he chose to protect his secret relationship with his sister by making me doubt my own sanity. I've filed for divorce and requested emergency custody of the children, pending a full investigation into what happened during those unsupervised visits. The police are reviewing the Ring footage and interviewing both Tom and Jessica about the extent of her contact with our kids. Our pediatrician has recommended counseling for both children to help process whatever they may have experienced. The worst part isn't even the betrayal or the danger he put our children in, though both of those are devastating. The worst part is that I'll never be able to trust my own perceptions around him again. For months, when I noticed that something felt off, he convinced me that I was the problem. He made me doubt my memory, my judgment, my mental stability, all to protect a secret that could have destroyed our children's lives. Every time I question whether I'm overreacting or being too harsh, I remember those tampons appearing in impossible places and how he watched me struggle to understand what was happening while knowing exactly what was causing it. The deliberate cruelty of allowing someone to psychologically torment me while pretending to be concerned about my well-being is something I'll never be able to forgive. Trust, once broken by such deception, leaves scars that never fully heal. I never thought my own daughter would break my heart so completely. But sometimes the people we love most are capable of the cruelest betrayals. I'm 45 now, but this story starts when I was 35 and going through the most devastating period of my life. My daughter Lily was 12 then, and I thought we had an unbreakable bond. I was wrong about a lot of things. Lily's mother Rachel and I divorced when Lily was 10. It wasn't an ugly split, just two people who'd grown apart and couldn't make it work anymore. Rachel got primary custody since she didn't work and could provide more stability, but I had Lily every weekend and one evening during the week. Those weekends were everything to me. I lived for Friday evenings when I'd pick her up from school, seeing her face light up when she spotted my car in the pickup line. We had our routines, our special places, our inside jokes. Saturday mornings meant pancakes and cartoons. Sunday afternoons were for hiking or going to museums or just wandering around downtown talking about everything and nothing. Lily was smart and funny and curious about the world, and I felt like the luckiest dad alive to be her guide through it all. Rachel started dating someone new about 6 months after our divorce was finalized. His name was Richard, and from what I could tell, he was everything I wasn't. He worked in finance, made serious money, lived in one of those massive houses in the wealthy part of town. When Lily mentioned him casually during one of our weekend trips, I tried to be supportive. I wanted Rachel to be happy, and if that meant Lily would have a positive male role model in her life when she wasn't with me, that could only be a good thing. The changes started small. Lily would mention exciting plans she had with Richard. Trips to expensive restaurants or shows I couldn't afford. She'd casually reference gifts he'd bought her, designer clothes or electronics that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I tried not to feel jealous, reminding myself that I could give her things Richard never could, like genuine attention and unconditional love. But gradually, I started noticing that our weekends together were becoming less important to her. She'd seem distracted during our activities, checking her phone constantly, or talking about plans she had with Richard and her mom. When I suggested our usual hiking spots, she'd wrinkle her nose and say they were kind of boring compared to the ski trips Richard had been taking them on. The first time Lily asked to skip our weekend together, my heart sank. She said Richard was taking her and Rachel to a luxury resort for the weekend, and she really didn't want to miss it. I agreed because I wanted her to be happy. But something inside me started to crack. The weekend visits became increasingly optional from her perspective, and I found myself competing with a man who had unlimited resources and no history of having to discipline her or enforce bedtimes. Over the course of a year, Lily went from being excited about our time together to viewing it as an obligation she had to endure. She'd complain about my small apartment, my modest car, the fact that we couldn't go to the expensive restaurants she'd grown accustomed to. When I tried to plan activities that didn't cost much, she'd sigh dramatically and ask why we couldn't just go shopping like she did with Richard. The conversations became painful. Lily would casually mention that Richard was planning to send her to private school, that he was going to take her to Europe next summer, that he'd promised to buy her a car when she turned 16. Every story was a reminder of how much more he could offer her than I ever could. I started dreading our weekends together because I knew I'd spend them feeling inadequate and watching my daughter wish she was somewhere else. Richard had been in their lives for almost 2 years when Rachel called me to discuss something important. She said Lily had been talking about wanting Richard to adopt her, to make their family official and complete. At first, I thought this was just a phase, a 12-year-old's romantic notion about fairy tale stepfathers. But when Rachel suggested we all meet with a lawyer to discuss the possibility, I realized how serious this had become. The meeting was arranged at a family law office downtown. I walked in expecting to have a conversation about Lily's feelings, maybe some family counseling to help everyone navigate this transition. Instead, I found myself sitting across from Lily, Rachel, Richard, and their lawyer, while my own hastily hired attorney shuffled through papers he'd barely had time to review. The lawyer explained that in order for Richard to legally adopt Lily, I would need to voluntarily terminate my parental rights. The words hit me like physical blows. Give up any legal claim to the child who had been the center of my universe for 12 years. I looked at Lily, hoping to see some sign that this wasn't really what she wanted, that she was just caught up in the excitement of feeling wanted by her wealthy stepfather. Instead, she looked me directly in the eyes and said she wanted Richard to be her real father. She said I could still see her sometimes if she felt like it, but she wanted to belong to Richard's family completely. The devastation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I tried to explain to Lily what this would mean, that I wouldn't legally be her father anymore, that Richard could decide I was never allowed to see her again if he chose. She said she understood and that she trusted Richard to do what was best for her. When I asked if she was sure this was what she wanted, she nodded without hesitation. I signed the papers that day, though I barely remember doing it. The lawyer kept talking about procedures and waiting periods, but I was drowning in grief. My daughter had chosen money and luxury over the man who had loved her unconditionally since the day she was born. Worse, she seemed relieved to be done with me, like I'd been a burden she was finally free to shed. The aftermath nearly destroyed me. I fell into a depression so deep I couldn't work for months. I moved away from the city, where every street corner reminded me of weekend adventures with Lily. I went to therapy, started taking antidepressants, slowly began the process of rebuilding a life that no longer revolved around being someone's father. It took 3 years before I could think about Lily without feeling like I was drowning. By then, I'd met Sarah, a kind woman who understood my pain without trying to fix it. We married when I was 40, and she brought her own daughter from a previous marriage into our family. 2 years later, we had a son together. I learned to love again, to be a father again, but there was always a lily-shaped hole in my heart that never quite healed. Last month, 10 years after signing away my rights, I was leaving my office building when I saw a familiar figure standing by my car. It took me a moment to recognize her because she looked so different from the confident 12-year-old who had dismissed me from her life. This young woman was thin, hollow-eyed, and desperate in a way that immediately put me on guard. Lily recognized me immediately and started crying the moment our eyes met. She said she'd been looking for me for weeks, that she needed my help, that everything had gone wrong and I was the only person she could turn to. She told me that Rachel had died 6 months earlier from cancer, and that Richard had essentially abandoned her as soon as the funeral was over. The story that poured out of her was heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. Richard had spoiled her for years but never insisted she develop any practical skills or work ethic. She dropped out of high school at 16 because Richard said she didn't need an education with his wealth behind her. She'd never held a job, never learned to manage money, never faced any real consequences for her choices. When Rachel got sick, Richard started pulling away emotionally and financially. After Rachel's death, he told Lily that their relationship had been about his love for her mother, and that he no longer felt obligated to support her. He'd given her a small amount of money to get started on her own, and told her it was time for her to learn independence. Lily begged me to help her, to let her move in with me and Sarah, to support her while she figured out how to navigate the adult world she was completely unprepared for. She cried as she told me how sorry she was for choosing Richard over me. How she realized now that money wasn't the same as love. How she'd been a stupid kid who made a terrible mistake. There's something particularly heartbreaking about watching the consequences of our children's choices play out years later. When you see the path of destruction that follows decisions made in moments of selfishness or short-sightedness, it's almost impossible not to feel some responsibility for the pain that results. Sometimes love means letting people face the results of their decisions, even when it destroys us to watch. Part of me wanted to wrap her in my arms and promise that everything would be okay, that I'd take care of her the way I'd always dreamed of being able to do. But I'd built a new life with people who depended on me, and I couldn't disrupt that stability for someone who had chosen to leave me behind when it was convenient. I told Lily I was glad to see her, and that I hoped she could find her way to a better life. I offered to help her research job training programs or community college options, to be a supportive presence as she learned to stand on her own. But I also made it clear that I couldn't provide financial support or housing, that my primary responsibilities were to the family I'd built after she left. Lily's demeanor changed instantly when she realized I wasn't going to rescue her. The tears stopped, and she looked at me with the same cold calculation I remembered from that lawyer's office 10 years earlier. She said she'd expected more from someone who claimed to have loved her, that she'd thought I'd be grateful for the chance to have her back in my life. When I didn't respond the way she wanted, she left without another word. I haven't heard from her since, though my mother called last week to tell me that a young woman claiming to be my daughter had shown up at her house asking for money. Apparently, Lily had made some disparaging comments about my beggar stepchildren when my mother suggested she try to reconcile with me properly. I've talked to a lawyer about getting a restraining order if Lily continues to harass my family members. The children we raise don't always become the adults we hoped they'd be. I never thought I'd have to threaten my own adult children to get them to contribute something meaningful to society. But sometimes tough love is the only option left. I'm 55 years old, and I've been running my own consulting business for nearly 30 years. Through a combination of hard work, smart investments, and honestly some good luck, I've built something substantial. My wife, Patricia, and I aren't millionaires, but we're comfortable enough that money hasn't been a daily stress for our family in over a decade. We have 2 adult children who should be the pride of my life, but instead, they've become my biggest source of frustration. Ethan is 28, graduated from a good university with a business degree, and has never held a job for longer than 6 months. Maya is 26, has a marketing degree she's never used professionally, and spends her days trying to become an influencer on social media with about as much success as you'd expect. When they were growing up, Patricia and I wanted to give them opportunities we'd never had. Private schools, summer camps, study abroad programs, anything that would help them develop into capable, confident adults. We established trust funds for both of them when they were born, thinking we were securing their futures and giving them a safety net to take risks and pursue their dreams. What we actually created were 2 adults who have never experienced genuine struggle or developed any appreciation for the value of work. Ethan spends his days playing video games, hanging out with friends who are equally aimless, and buying expensive gadgets with his trust fund money. Maya posts carefully curated photos of her breakfast and calls it building her personal brand, as if taking pictures of avocado toast constitutes a career strategy. The breaking point came during a family dinner 6 months ago. Patricia and I had been talking about our retirement plans. Nothing concrete, but just general thoughts about what we might want to do when we eventually step back from the business. The conversation was casual until I mentioned that we'd need to make decisions about the future of the company. That got both kids' attention immediately, probably because they were calculating how much the business might be worth and when they could expect to inherit it. I suggested that maybe one or both of them might be interested in learning the operations and eventually taking over. The response was immediate and crushing. Ethan actually laughed out loud and said he wasn't interested in wasting his life working 60-hour weeks like I did. He said his trust fund provided enough income to live comfortably without the stress of running a business. Maya chimed in with some nonsense about being too busy building her personal brand to get distracted by traditional career paths. I asked them what exactly they were planning to do with their lives, and the conversation that followed opened my eyes to just how completely I'd failed as a parent. Ethan said he didn't see the point of working when he already had enough money to support his lifestyle. Maya started talking about her follower count and engagement metrics like they were meaningful measures of success, even though she's never earned $1 from her so-called influence. Neither of them had any long-term goals beyond maintaining their current level of comfort and entertainment. They'd never considered what they might contribute to the world, or how they might create value for other people. The trust funds I'd thought were safety nets had become golden handcuffs, removing any incentive for them to develop skills, work ethic, or purpose. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my own father, who worked construction his entire life, and taught me that self-respect comes from earning what you have. He would be horrified to see what his grandchildren had become. I realized that by trying to spare them from financial stress, I'd rob them of the satisfaction that comes from overcoming challenges and building something meaningful. The next morning, I made a decision that I knew would create chaos, but felt necessary for everyone's long-term well-being. I called a family meeting and announced that I was changing the terms of their inheritances. From now on, neither Ethan nor Maya would receive another penny from their trust funds or from my estate until they had worked full-time jobs for at least 2 years. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Ethan accused me of holding their futures hostage over some outdated obsession with traditional employment. Maya started crying and said I was trying to ruin her life just when her social media career was starting to gain momentum. They both seemed genuinely shocked that I would expect them to work for money like regular people. I explained that this wasn't about punishment. It was about helping them develop into adults I could be proud of. I told them I'd watched them drift for years without purpose or accomplishment, and I wasn't going to enable that behavior any longer. If they wanted to inherit anything from me, they needed to prove they could function in the real world. The extended family got involved within days. My brother called to tell me I was being too harsh, that young people faced different challenges than our generation and needed more understanding. Patricia's sister accused me of trying to control our adult children's lives instead of letting them find their own paths. Even Patricia seemed uncertain about my approach, though she ultimately supported my decision. Ethan and Maya spent weeks trying to find loopholes or alternatives that would satisfy my requirements without actually requiring them to submit to traditional employment. Ethan decided he was going to become a day trader, claiming that managing investments was essentially a job. He lost about $3,000 in his first month and quietly abandoned that plan. Maya tried to convince me that her influencer activities constituted self-employment and should count toward my 2-year requirement. When I asked her to show me her business plan, profit and loss statements, or any evidence that she was actually earning money from her online presence, she couldn't produce anything concrete. You know, it's fascinating how people can live in complete denial about their own situations when the truth is too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Both of my children had convinced themselves that their hobbies and interests were actually careers, that their lack of income was just a temporary setback, rather than evidence that they weren't providing any real value to anyone. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their delusions, even when it means watching them struggle. The turning point came when they realized I wasn't going to back down or accept their creative interpretations of employment. Ethan was the first to crack, probably because his lifestyle was more expensive than Maya's and he was burning through his remaining savings faster. He found a job at a local manufacturing plant. Nothing glamorous, but honest work with decent pay and benefits. His first few weeks were brutal. He'd come home exhausted and complaining about the early hours, the physical demands, and the monotony of the work. He couldn't understand why anyone would choose such a difficult way to earn money when other options existed. But gradually, something shifted. He started talking about his coworkers, the satisfaction of completing projects, the respect he earned by showing up consistently and doing his job well. Maya took longer to accept reality, but eventually found a position with a marketing agency downtown. She hated it initially, constantly complaining about her supervisor's expectations and the deadlines she had to meet. But after a few months, she started mentioning projects she was working on, campaigns she'd helped develop, clients who'd been happy with her contributions. The changes in both of them have been remarkable. They're more confident, more engaged with the world around them, more interesting to talk to because they have actual experiences to share instead of just opinions about things they've never done. They've started setting goals, making plans, thinking about their futures in terms of what they want to accomplish rather than just what they want to consume. Our family dinners are completely different now. Instead of listening to complaints about boredom or vague plans for social media success, I hear stories about workplace challenges, professional development opportunities, and genuine pride in accomplishments they've earned through their own efforts. Ethan has been promoted twice and is considering going back to school for additional training. Maya is talking about starting her own marketing consultancy eventually. The best part is that they seem happier. Not the artificial contentment that comes from endless entertainment and no responsibilities, but the deeper satisfaction that comes from knowing you're capable of supporting yourself and contributing something valuable to the world. They're building relationships with people who respect them for their work, rather than tolerating them for their money. Looking back, I realize I should have done this years earlier. The trust funds that I thought were gifts were actually burdens, preventing them from discovering their own capabilities and developing genuine self-confidence. By removing that safety net, I forced them to develop skills they never knew they had and find purpose they didn't know they were missing. It's been almost 18 months since I issued my ultimatum, and both kids are well on their way to meeting the 2-year requirement. More importantly, they've both indicated that they have no intention of returning to their previous lifestyle of leisure and self-indulgence. They've discovered that earning respect and accomplishment feels better than simply inheriting comfort. Patricia and I are already discussing how to modify our estate planning to reflect the positive changes we've seen. Instead of simply handing over large sums of money, we're thinking about creating incentive structures that will encourage continued growth and contribution throughout their lives. We want to support their ambitions without removing their motivation to keep striving. The experience has taught me that sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is the gift of struggle, the opportunity to discover their own strength and resilience. By trying to spare them from difficulty, I nearly robbed them of the chance to become the people they were capable of being. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is the gift of struggle. I'm still trying to process everything that happened to my family over the past year, and honestly, putting this story out there feels like the only way to make sense of it all. I'm 30 years old, father to 4 children ages 6 through 14, and until 8 months ago, I thought I had a pretty solid marriage to my wife Lisa. We'd been together for 16 years, married for 12, and I'd been working myself to the bone to support our family while she stayed home with the kids. I've always been the primary breadwinner, working 2 jobs to keep us comfortable. My main job is in warehouse management, but I also do freelance bookkeeping on evenings and weekends to cover the extras like school activities, family vacations, and the general expenses that come with raising 4 kids. Lisa chose to be a stay-at-home mom when our oldest was born, and I supported that decision completely. I wanted our children to have a parent available for school events, sick days, and all the daily care that working parents sometimes have to outsource. What I didn't expect was how the household responsibilities would shake out over the years. Despite Lisa being home full-time, I found myself doing most of the cooking, cleaning, and childcare whenever I wasn't at work. I'd come home from a 10-hour day to find dishes piled in the sink, laundry overflowing, and Lisa frustrated about being cooped up with the kids all day. I told myself this was normal, that being home with children was exhausting work even if it didn't look like traditional employment. The pattern continued for years. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. to get the kids ready for school, pack their lunches, and drop them off on my way to work. Lisa would pick them up in the afternoon, but by the time I got home around 7 p.m., they'd usually be watching television while she scrolled through her phone. I'd make dinner, help with homework, handle baths and bedtime routines, then work on my freelance projects until well past midnight. Weekends were spent catching up on housework, running errands, and handling the maintenance tasks that had piled up during the week. Lisa would often make plans with her friends during this time, saying she needed a break from the kids in the house. I understood the need for adult social time, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a full day to myself or even a few hours to pursue my own interests. The breaking point came 6 months ago when Lisa announced that she wanted to take a 2-week vacation to Mexico with her girlfriends. The timing couldn't have been worse because I'd already arranged to take my first weekend off in over a year to visit my brother, who lived about 4 hours away. I rarely got to see him because of my work schedule, and we'd been planning this trip for months. When I explained that I couldn't watch the kids for 2 weeks because of my own plans, Lisa became furious. She accused me of being selfish and unsupportive, saying that she deserved a break after years of taking care of our family. The irony of this accusation hit me like a physical blow. I was working 70-hour weeks while doing most of the actual childcare and housework, but somehow I was the selfish one for wanting a single weekend with my brother. The argument escalated quickly, with Lisa listing all the ways I was supposedly failing as a husband and father. She said I didn't appreciate how hard it was to be home with the kids all day, that I never helped around the house, that I expected her to handle everything while I got to escape to work every day. Each accusation felt like a slap in the face because it was so completely contrary to our actual reality. That's when I decided to take a sick day and really observe what Lisa's daily routine looked like. I called in to work claiming a stomach bug, sent the kids off to school as usual, and settled in to see how Lisa spent her days when she thought I wasn't around. What I discovered was eye-opening and infuriating. Lisa slept until almost 10 a.m., then spent the morning texting friends and browsing social media while drinking coffee and watching television. She made minimal effort to clean or organize anything, letting dishes accumulate and ignoring the general chaos that 4 kids create. When it was time to pick up the younger kids from school, she'd throw on clothes and leave the house looking like she'd been busy all day. But the strangest part was how she kept trying to get me to leave the house. She suggested I run errands, go to the doctor for my supposed illness, or visit my mother who lived across town. Every few hours, she'd come up with some urgent reason I needed to be somewhere else. When I insisted I felt too sick to drive anywhere, she seemed genuinely agitated by my presence. Around lunchtime, I decided to check our household computer to look into our finances, specifically to see if we could afford Lisa's expensive vacation. That's when I found browser history that changed everything. Lisa had been running an OnlyFans account for over 2 years, creating adult content and earning substantial money that she'd been hiding from me. The financial records were devastating. She'd been making between $3,000 and $5,000 per month from her online activities, money that could have eliminated our constant financial stress and allowed me to cut back on my second job. Instead, she'd been depositing the income into a secret account while complaining constantly about our tight budget and my inability to provide better for our family. But discovering the OnlyFans account was just the beginning of a much larger betrayal. As I dug deeper into her online activities, I found evidence of multiple affairs spanning several years. Dating app conversations, hotel receipts, text message threads with men I'd never heard of. Lisa had been living a completely double life while I worked myself to exhaustion, supporting what I thought was our shared commitment to our family. The timeline of her affairs coincided perfectly with the births of our younger 3 children. The sick realization hit me that some of the kids I'd been raising and loving as my own might not actually be mine biologically. The thought was so painful I almost couldn't process it, but I knew I had to find out the truth. I arranged DNA testing for all 4 children without telling Lisa what I was doing. The wait for results was the longest 2 weeks of my life. I continued working, continued taking care of the kids, continued pretending everything was normal while dying inside from the weight of what I suspected. When the results came back, my worst fears were confirmed. My oldest daughter was mine, but the 3 younger children were not. 12 years of my life. 12 years of loving and supporting children who shared my name but not my genetics. 12 years of sacrificing my health, my career advancement, my personal relationships to provide for a family that was built on lies. The emotional trauma of learning about Lisa's betrayals was overwhelming, but the physical impact was even more immediate. The night I received the DNA results, I had a massive heart attack. The stress, the sleep deprivation, the years of overwork, and the shock of discovering the truth about my family had pushed my body past its breaking point. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later with Lisa sitting beside my bed, crying and apologizing. She'd found the DNA test results while I was unconscious and knew that her secrets were finally exposed. She tried to explain her behavior, claiming she'd felt trapped and unappreciated, that the affairs were mistakes she regretted, that the OnlyFans account was just a way to feel desired and valued. But her parents, who had rushed to the hospital when they heard about my heart attack, had also learned the truth. Lisa's father was horrified by what his daughter had done, and her mother was devastated by the realization that their grandchildren might not actually be related to me. They apologized to me repeatedly, saying they'd raised Lisa better than this and couldn't understand how she'd become capable of such deception. The recovery process was long and complicated, both physically and emotionally. I had to relearn how to manage stress, how to prioritize my health, how to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of neglect. Lisa moved out of our house during my hospitalization, finding her own apartment with money from her secret accounts. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly smooth because Lisa's parents encouraged her to be fair and honest about the division of assets. They were so ashamed of her behavior that they actively worked against their own daughter's attempts to claim spousal support or shared custody of the children who weren't biologically mine. The hardest part of this entire ordeal has been figuring out how to maintain relationships with the 3 children who aren't genetically mine but who I've loved and raised as my own for years. They didn't choose the circumstances of their conception, and they don't deserve to lose the only father they've ever known because of their mother's betrayals. I've continued to be their dad in every way that matters. I still help with homework, attend school events, and provide emotional support when they need it. The DNA results don't change the fact that I taught them to ride bikes, comforted them through nightmares, and celebrated every milestone of their young lives. They're innocent victims of their mother's choices, and I refuse to punish them for something they had no control over. Lisa's parents have been incredible throughout this process, maintaining relationships with all the children while making it clear that they don't condone their daughter's behavior. They've helped with childcare during my recovery, contributed financially to expenses I can no longer afford alone, and provided emotional support that I never expected to receive from my ex-wife's family. The experience has taught me that family isn't always defined by genetics, but it is always defined by commitment, love, and sacrifice. Lisa broke that commitment in the most fundamental ways possible. But the bonds I've formed with the children I've raised remain strong regardless of DNA test results. I'm still rebuilding my life, my health, and my trust in relationships. The betrayal cut so deep that I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully open my heart to a romantic partner again. But I've learned to prioritize my well-being, to set boundaries, and to recognize the difference between people who deserve my loyalty and those who take advantage of it. The deepest wounds often come from those we trust most completely. I never expected that sharing the most painful part of my past with my wife would end up destroying our marriage. But sometimes the people we trust most are the least equipped to handle our deepest truths. I'm 27 years old, been married to Jennifer for 3 years, and up until 6 months ago, I thought we had a solid relationship built on honesty and mutual support. I was wrong about a lot of things. The trauma happened when I was 9 years old. My parents hired this babysitter named Carla, who was maybe 19 at the time, home from college for the summer. She seemed responsible and came with good recommendations from other families in our neighborhood. What my parents didn't know was that she was using her access to children for her own twisted purposes. The abuse went on for about 4 months while my parents worked late shifts. Carla would wait until my younger brother fell asleep. Then she'd call me into the living room and tell me we were going to play special games that had to stay secret between us. She'd touch me inappropriately, force me to touch her, and make me participate in sexual acts that I was far too young to understand, but knew instinctively felt wrong. The worst part wasn't even the physical abuse itself. It was the psychological manipulation that came with it. Carla would buy me expensive toys and video games afterward, telling me these were rewards for being such a good boy and keeping our special secret. She'd threaten me with violence if I ever told anyone, but she'd also make me feel like I was somehow complicit in what was happening because I'd started to anticipate the rewards that came after. When Carla went back to college in the fall, the abuse stopped, but the damage was already done. I spent years trying to make sense of what had happened to me, feeling confused about whether it was actually abuse since she'd given me things I wanted and I hadn't always tried to stop it. The shame and confusion followed me through middle school and high school, affecting my ability to form healthy relationships and trust adults. I tried to tell my parents once when I was about 14, but their reaction was devastating. My father accused me of making up stories for attention and grounded me for lying. My mother suggested that I was confused about normal childhood experiences because I'd been watching too much inappropriate content online. When I insisted it was true, my father became so angry that I was afraid he might hit me, so I dropped the subject and never brought it up again. The few times I tried to confide in friends over the years, the reactions were either dismissive or made me feel even worse about what had happened. Male friends would say I was lucky to have had sexual experiences so young, completely missing the point that what happened was abuse, not some kind of adolescent fantasy. Female friends either didn't believe me or suggested I was exaggerating a normal interaction for sympathy. By the time I met Jennifer, I'd learned to keep that part of my past buried. We'd been together for 4 years total, married for 3. And I'd never mentioned the abuse because I was terrified of how she might react. Every relationship I'd tried to have before Jennifer had ended badly when my trauma responses interfered with physical intimacy, so I'd gotten good at managing my triggers and avoiding situations that might require explanations. But last month, Jennifer suggested we watch this Netflix show called Baby Reindeer together. She'd heard good things about it from coworkers, and it was getting a lot of critical acclaim. I knew it dealt with stalking and sexual abuse themes, but I thought I could handle it. I'd been in therapy on and off for years, and I felt like I'd processed most of my childhood trauma successfully. I was completely unprepared for how viscerally the show would affect me. By the 4th episode, I was having flashbacks so intense I felt like I was 9 years old again. The details were different, but the emotional core of what the main character experienced resonated with my own memories in ways that left me shaking and struggling to breathe. Jennifer noticed I was crying and paused the show to ask what was wrong. For the first time in our relationship, I felt ready to trust her with the truth about my past. I told her everything about Carla, about the abuse, about how my family had reacted when I tried to tell them, about the years of therapy and the ongoing impact it had on my life. Her immediate response seemed supportive. She held me while I cried, told me she was sorry I'd experienced something so traumatic, and said she was grateful I'd trusted her enough to share something so personal. We went to bed that night, with me feeling closer to her than I'd ever felt before. Like we'd crossed some important threshold in our relationship. But over the following days, I noticed subtle changes in Jennifer's behavior toward me. She stopped initiating physical affection, seemed uncomfortable when I tried to kiss her, and became distant in ways that reminded me of how people had treated me in the past when they found out about my abuse. When I asked if everything was okay, she insisted nothing had changed and that I was being paranoid. The shift was gradual but undeniable. Jennifer started spending more time out with friends, stayed late at work more frequently, and seemed to be looking for reasons to avoid being alone with me. When I tried to talk to her about what I was sensing, she'd either deny that anything was different or suggest that I was projecting my own issues onto our relationship. 3 weeks after I'd disclosed my abuse, we got into an argument about something completely unrelated. I'd forgotten to take out the trash, and Jennifer was frustrated because it meant we'd missed pickup and would have to deal with overflowing bins for another week. It was the kind of minor domestic dispute that every couple has occasionally, nothing that should have escalated beyond a brief apology and a promise to remember next week. But in the middle of our argument, Jennifer said something that felt like a physical blow. She looked me directly in the eyes and said, "At least I'm not lying about being raped, you attention-seeking narcissist." The words hit me with such force that I couldn't speak for several minutes. She immediately tried to take it back, saying she hadn't meant it and that she was just frustrated, but the damage was done. In one sentence, she dismissed my trauma as fabrication, accused me of seeking attention through lies about abuse, and called me narcissistic for sharing the most painful experience of my life with someone I thought I could trust. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend that night, needing space to process what had just happened. Jennifer called repeatedly, alternating between apologies and justifications for what she'd said. She claimed she'd been stressed about work and had lashed out unfairly. But she never actually acknowledged that what she'd said was fundamentally wrong, or that she believed me about the abuse. When I came home 2 days later to get more clothes, Jennifer was waiting for me. Instead of apologizing properly or trying to rebuild the trust she'd destroyed, she doubled down on her accusations. She said my timing was suspicious, that opening up about childhood trauma immediately after watching a show about sexual abuse seemed too convenient to be believable. She asked why I'd never mentioned the abuse during our 4 years together if it was really such a significant part of my past. She suggested that maybe I'd confused normal childhood experiences with abuse, or that I'd been influenced by the show to reinterpret innocent interactions as something more sinister. Every word felt like another betrayal, another confirmation that the person I'd married was incapable of supporting me through something this important. The conversation escalated when I tried to explain how difficult it is for male survivors to disclose abuse, how the shame and stigma had kept me silent for years. Jennifer became angry and accused me of making excuses, of trying to manipulate her with sob stories. When I started crying from frustration and hurt, she actually slapped me across the face and told me to stop being such a victim. That's when I knew our marriage was over. I'd spent my entire adult life learning to recognize the difference between people who could support me and those who would use my vulnerability against me. Jennifer had failed that test in the most devastating way possible, not just by disbelieving me, but by weaponizing my trauma during an argument about household chores. It takes incredible courage to share our deepest traumas with someone we love, only to have them turned into weapons against us. The betrayal cuts deeper than the original abuse in some ways, because at least Carla was a stranger who I never expected to protect me. Jennifer was supposed to be my partner, my safe harbor, the person who would believe me when the rest of the world didn't. Some betrayals cut so deep they change us forever, but sometimes that change leads us toward the healing we desperately need. I filed for divorce the following week, despite Jennifer's attempts to convince me I was overreacting to what she called a momentary lapse in judgment. She seemed genuinely surprised that I couldn't just forgive and move on, as if attacking someone's childhood trauma was a minor relationship hiccup rather than a fundamental betrayal of trust. The divorce process became ugly quickly when Jennifer realized I was serious about ending our marriage. She retaliated by contacting my friends and coworkers with fabricated stories about me being abusive and manipulative. She told people I'd made up the sexual abuse allegations to gain sympathy and control in our relationship, and that she was the real victim of my psychological manipulation. Most of my social circle believed her version of events, partly because she was more socially connected than I was, and partly because people are often more comfortable believing that men lie about abuse than acknowledging how common it actually is. I lost several friendships and had to deal with suspicious looks from coworkers who'd heard Jennifer's accusations. The professional consequences were the most devastating. Jennifer somehow got contact information from my employer and sent them detailed emails claiming I was unstable and potentially dangerous. She provided no evidence for her allegations, but the mere suggestion that I might be abusive was enough to create problems at work. I was eventually forced to resign rather than continue dealing with the hostile environment her accusations had created. I'm rebuilding my life now. 6 months after everything fell apart, I found a new job in a different industry, moved to a different part of town, and started therapy again with a counselor who specializes in male survivors of sexual abuse. The process has been painful but necessary, helping me understand that Jennifer's reaction says nothing about the validity of my experiences and everything about her character. The hardest part has been learning not to regret opening up about my trauma. For a while, I convinced myself that I should have kept the secret, that sharing it had only caused more pain and destruction. But my therapist has helped me see that Jennifer's abusive response was not my fault, and that staying silent to protect someone else's comfort would have been another form of self-harm. I still struggle with trusting people enough to share my story, but I'm working on building relationships with people who have proven they can handle difficult truths with compassion rather than judgment. The experience taught me that disclosure is always risky, but the right people will respond with support rather than weaponizing your pain against you. Sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is walk away from people who can't love us completely. These stories remind us that the human experience is complex, messy, and often heartbreaking. Each person who shared their story on Reddit was reaching out into the void, hoping someone would understand, someone would validate their pain. Someone would tell them they weren't crazy or wrong or alone. Behind every post we've heard tonight was a real person sitting at their computer or phone, typing out the most difficult moments of their lives because they needed witnesses to their pain. In these quiet hours, as you process these tales of betrayal, resilience, and the complicated nature of family bonds, remember that we're all just trying to make sense of our world. Whether you're here because sleep eludes you, because these stories help you unwind, or because you find comfort in knowing you're not alone in facing difficult people and impossible choices, you're part of a community that believes in the power of shared experience. We've heard stories tonight about parents who chose money over love, siblings who became strangers, spouses who weaponized trust, and children who learned to protect themselves by walking away. But we've also heard about resilience, about people who found the strength to set boundaries, to choose their own well-being, to rebuild their lives after devastating betrayals. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through some of Reddit's most compelling stories. If these tales have resonated with you, if they've helped you feel less alone in your own struggles, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the human condition. Until next time, may your own story be filled with understanding, genuine love, and people who believe you when you need them most. Sleep well, everyone.